Now, in our top story today, the African Tax Administration Forum, in collaboration with the African Union Commission and supported by the African Development Bank, is hosting a fourth high-level tax policy dialogue entitled Taxing Rights for Africa in the New World and the Effects of COVID-19. Now, the role of the tax policymakers and the tax administrators. The virtual conference was delivered over 2 days from the 26th to the 27th, and it brought together tax policymakers, tax administrators, development partners, tax experts, academics, SCOs, and research organizations. The African Capacity Building Foundation Executive Secretary, Professor Emmanuel Nadozi, is joining me this evening to discuss exactly what this session was about. Professor, very good evening to you. Thank you for granting an interview with the Galaxy Universal Network. Thank you for speaking to us. Could you please talk to us about, what the session was about to start with? I understand you're a panelist on this session of the impact of the AfCFTA on trade and tax revenue on the African states. Give us an overview of the aim of this discussion.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and greetings to all your viewers all over the world. I'm very, very, very happy to be here to discuss the issue of the impact of the AfCFTA on tax revenues. This session was organized because, as you know very well, as part of the African Union's Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, the ambitious implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, was expected to positively have impact on African economies, resulting from increased trade among nations. Mm-hmm. But although the planning of the starting of this CFTA was supposed to be the 1st of July 2020, but as everyone knows, because of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, this has been delayed to next year, early next year, and therefore the economic boom that was expected to arise from the full implementation could not have the kind of positive impact it could have had on revenues across the continent. But we still feel that the implementation will result in positive impact on tax revenues across the continent in the long run. However, it's also understood that in the short term, tax revenue would reduce in some African countries as a result of AfCFTA. So in this regard, therefore, we were supposed to look at these issues. And I was specifically to try to provide some views on the impact of the AfCFTA on tax revenues and the sort of tax policy measures that tax administrators could undertake to benefit from the implementation of the AfCFTA. Mm. So I began by highlighting a couple of things. The basic things being the key challenges facing tax revenue mobilization in particular, and in general, domestic resource mobilization in many African countries. One is a very narrow tax base. Two is high levels of capital flight and illicit financial outflows. Three is tax evasion and avoidance. And four is lack of legitimacy of tax administration. And five is proliferation of tax exemptions and relatively low penetration of the formal banking sector. And the sixth one, which is the most important in my view, is the low human, institutional, and composite capacities that are supposed to be necessary to really increase tax revenue mobilization. Mm. So I did also give some specific recommendations on what could be done to maximize the benefits that can come in terms of revenue mobilization in the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area.
Yeah, and Professor, as well, there have been growing fears that the Africa Free Trade Agreement and is anticipated gains, its associated losses as well, are likely to accrue unevenly across the continent, dominated by perhaps a few big regional players. Is there a special differential treatment in the implementation and the provisions on the elimination of import duties, so to speak, and other tariffs?
Yes, of course. The beauty of the Continental Free Trade Agreement and the negotiations that have been taking place so far is that a lot of these issues were brought onto the table. Example is the one that you mentioned of the possibility of winners and losers, and also countries being at different levels, because it's understood that mostly the countries that have a higher or larger manufacturing sector or have a more diversified economies are likely to gain more than the others. But the consensus from everybody is that everybody will be better off with the free trade area than without it, even though there may be certain issues. So to address this sort of differential treatment that is necessary to minimize the impact on potential losers, there is what's called the principle of variable geometry, which necessarily one of the cornerstones of the principles that are enshrined in the agreement. That is to say that all member states aim to achieve the same level of tariff liberalization with 90% of the tariff lines to be liberalized. But there are some concessionary frameworks that have been put in place. Aside from what the countries that consider certain sectors to be strategic, which will not immediately be opened up because they gave them some allowance on that. There is the LDCs, for example, have 10 years to achieve 90% of liberalization, while the non-LDCs have 5 years. So this is the differential geometry that I'm talking about. And the remaining 10% of tariff lines is divided into two categories. One is 7% for sensitive products and 3% of tariff lines excluded from the liberalization. But also, the agreement also puts in place the possibility of setting up the dispute settlement mechanism that will enable countries that may have issues to be able to, for those to be adjudicated and in a way that will be acceptable to them. But the most important mechanism which we're advocating for now is some sort of a compensation mechanism, especially for some of the countries that we understand will be heavily affected. But overall, I mean, I'll say more about it, but overall, it's the potential benefits of having a free trade area far outweighs the initial short-term costs that will result from loss of revenues. But overall, every country, whether they are big or small, they need to invest in the capacity of revenue authorities. They need to incentivize their small and medium enterprises and private sector to supply required goods and services. And they need to widen the tax base to mobilize additional revenues from the positive effect of AfCFTA. So they're not just simply taxing civil servants who are easily taxable. And they need to, in particular, pay attention to digitalization of tax administration to improve efficiency and reduce tax evasion and fraud. Right. Finally, they also need to digitalize, they need to pay attention to ensuring that the economy is also diversified within the period that they have so that they'll be able to increase their exports.
So I suppose that answers the question of the next question I was going to ask you of least developed countries that rely heavily on international trade taxes as a source of government revenue. Let's talk about small to medium enterprises, how they can be capacitated so they can be part of the value chain of this agreement trade deal. What have been some of your recommendations in terms of policy making?
Oh yes, of course, every country must have a strategy and a plan put in place for improving the capacity and the operations of small and medium enterprises, because that's the largest employers of people, and they are also major contributors in many African countries. Therefore, having policies in place, whether they are government policy that will incentivize them, that's one, and number two, that will help working with partners put in place specific programs, such as the one that ACBF does. For example, we currently, even with the COVID-19, have in place in some countries what we call the entrepreneurship promotion for women and youth. And those are the small and medium enterprises that we're targeting, a group of them, to really give them the ability to be able to, first of all, stay in business and maybe even grow their business and be able to have opportunities to really increase their market access and ability to run their businesses properly. So, a panoply of things that are put in place. And thirdly is also the issue of finance, which is very, very critical. And often these are the segments of the business community that have difficulty getting regular finance from established financial institutions. So there's even countries such as the United States have what they call the Small Business Administration. And so there's a targeting of financing for those that are not, they don't have the collateral or don't have the mechanism to get those kinds of things. So a number of things that are policy-oriented and policy-driven can be put in place to support these businesses.
Indeed. Thank you so much for this conversation, Professor. Very insightful indeed, and I believe our viewers will be able to take away very invaluable lessons from what you have imparted with us today. Thank you so much for speaking to us. That's Professor Emmanuel Nadozie. He is the Executive Secretary of AfCFTA. And with that, we'll take a very short break.